An 8-year-old black girl burst into the courtroom screaming for her brother. When the judge demanded silence and she started speaking, even the prosecutor couldn't hold back his tears. Sarah's stomach growled again. She pressed her small hand against it, trying to silence the noise. The classroom clock read 10:43 a.m. 2 hours and 17 minutes until lunch. Her notebook lay open on the desk, empty except for the date scrawled in the top corner. Sarah? Sarah Johnson. Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through her hunger-induced daze. Can you tell us what 8 times 7 is? Sarah blinked hard, forcing herself to focus. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as 24 pairs of third-grade eyes turned to stare at her. She gripped her pencil tighter, her palms sweaty. Her voice came out as a whisper. The numbers swam before her eyes. 56, Tommy whispered from the desk behind her. 56, Sarah repeated, louder this time. Mrs. Peterson's forehead creased with concern. That's correct, Sarah. But next time, let's try to solve it on our own, okay? Sarah nodded, her pigtails bouncing slightly. She hadn't eaten since yesterday's school lunch, a half portion of mac and cheese she'd shared with her friend Maya. Michael had promised they'd have dinner, but when he came home last night, his pockets were empty again. The morning dragged on. Sarah's head felt heavy, and the words on the whiteboard blurred together. When the lunch bell finally rang, she stayed in her seat, watching her classmates file out with their colorful lunch boxes and brown paper bags. Sarah? Mrs. Peterson approached her desk. Aren't you going to lunch? I forgot my lunch money, Sarah mumbled, staring at her worn-out sneakers. Mrs. Peterson pulled up a chair and sat beside her. This is the 3rd time this week, sweetheart. Is everything okay at home? Sarah's heart raced. Michael had warned her about questions like this. Everything's fine. Michael he just forgot to give me lunch money today. And yesterday? And Monday? Sarah's fingers twisted the hem of her oversized hand-me-down t-shirt. He's been really busy with work. Mrs. Peterson reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a brown paper bag. Here, I always pack extra, just in case. The smell of peanut butter made Sarah's mouth water. I can't. Yes, you can. Mrs. Peterson placed the bag on her desk. Eat up, then join the others at recess. Sarah waited until Mrs. Peterson left before tearing into the sandwich. She forced herself to eat slowly, remembering Michael's words. When you get food, make it last. We never know when the next meal's coming. Across town, Michael wiped sweat from his forehead as he loaded another box onto the truck. The summer heat beat down on the loading dock, making the air shimmer above the concrete. Hey kid, the supervisor called out. That's the last one for today. Here's your pay. Michael caught the envelope the man tossed his way. $40 for 6 hours of work. Not enough. Never enough. Any chance of more work tomorrow? Michael asked, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. The supervisor shook his head. Nah, truck's done for the week. Try the construction site on Madison. They're always looking for day laborers. Michael's shoulders slumped as he walked away. The envelope felt too light in his pocket. The rent was 2 weeks overdue, and Mr. Martinez had already threatened eviction twice. The electricity bill was marked "Final Notice" in angry red letters, and Sarah needed new shoes. Her old ones had holes in the soles. He checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Sarah's school. His stomach knotted. The social worker must have made another surprise visit. The apartment building came into view, a dingy 5-story walk-up with graffiti-covered walls and a broken elevator. Home, if you could call it that. Michael climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, his legs heavy with exhaustion. As he reached for his keys, Mr. Martinez's door opened. Johnson, where's my rent? Michael's hand instinctively tightened around the envelope in his pocket. Mr. Martinez, I can give you half today, half? Half doesn't pay my mortgage. The landlord's face reddened. You've got until Friday. After that, you and your sister are out. The door slammed shut. Michael leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. Friday. 2 days to come up with $600. Inside their apartment, the walls seemed to close in. Paint peeled in long strips, exposing the yellowed plaster beneath. The small kitchen held a hot plate, a mini fridge, and a collection of mismatched dishes from the dollar store. The living room doubled as Michael and Sarah's bedroom. His mattress on the floor, her small bed pushed against the far wall. Michael sat at the wobbly kitchen table and counted the money again. 40 from today, 30 from yesterday's landscaping job, and $12 in change from the jar on top of the fridge. $82 total. The front door creaked open. Sarah shuffled in, her backpack dragging on the floor. "Hey, Bug." Michael forced a smile. "How was school?" Sarah dropped her backpack and climbed onto his lap, wrapping her thin arms around his neck. She smelled like playground dust and the cheap soap they used at school. "Mrs. Peterson gave me lunch today." Michael's chest tightened. Another person noticing, another risk. "That was nice of her." "She asked about you again?" Sarah's voice was muffled against his shoulder. "I said you were busy with work like you told me to. Good girl?" Michael stroked her hair, noticing how it had lost its shine. "Hey, I got paid today. How about we have a feast?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "Really? Really? Go wash up while I make dinner." As Sarah skipped to the bathroom, Michael pulled out a can of SpaghettiOs and the last hot dog from the fridge. He cut the hot dog into tiny pieces, making it look like more than it was. The smell of tomato sauce filled the small kitchen as he heated their meal on the hot plate. They sat cross-legged on the floor, sharing the food from a single bowl. Michael watched Sarah eat, taking only small bites himself. She needed it more than he did. "Remember when Mom used to make real spaghetti?" Sarah asked between mouthfuls. "With meatballs and everything?" The memory hit Michael like a punch to the gut. Mom in the kitchen, humming as she stirred the sauce. Dad at the table, helping Sarah with her homework. Before the drugs took Dad away. Before the cancer took Mom. "Yeah, Bug. I remember." Sarah scraped the last bit of sauce from the bowl. "Can we have real spaghetti someday?" Michael looked at his sister's hopeful face, at the way her collarbones stuck out too sharply under her shirt, at the worn-out shoes and the empty kitchen cabinets, at the final notices piled on the table. "Sure, Bug. Someday." Later, after Sarah had fallen asleep, Michael sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The weight of their situation pressed down on him like a physical thing. No food, no money, no options left. He thought about the small grocery store 3 blocks away. The tired cashier who always looked half asleep. The broken security camera he'd noticed yesterday. Michael's hands started shaking. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't his father. Sarah whimpered in her sleep, curling into a tight ball on her bed. Michael stood up. He wasn't his father. He was Sarah's brother. And tomorrow, one way or another, she would eat. The city hummed outside their window, indifferent to the decision being made in a small, dark apartment on the 4th floor. Tomorrow would change everything. But for now, Michael watched his sister sleep, memorizing the peaceful look on her face, knowing it might be the last time he'd see it for a while. The fluorescent lights of Martinez Market buzzed overhead. Michael stood in aisle 3, staring at the shelves of pasta and sauce. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, right thumb running over the smooth edge of his last quarter. The store was empty except for old Mrs. Chun picking through the vegetables up front and Joey, the night cashier, half asleep behind the counter. Michael's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. The security camera in the corner hung limp, its red light dark, broken for weeks now. He'd noticed it during his last desperate search for discount bread. A box of spaghetti cost $1.29. The sauce was $2.99. Ground beef was $4.89 a pound. Simple math that added up to more than he had. Sarah's voice echoed in his head. "Can we have real spaghetti someday?" The clock on the wall read 9:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, Joey would do his nightly cigarette break. Michael had watched him for 3 nights straight, learning the routine. 3 minutes like clockwork, while Mrs. Chun finished her shopping. Michael's fingers brushed against the cold metal of the handcuffs in his dream this morning. He'd woken up sweating, his father's voice ringing in his ears. "Sometimes a man's gotta do what he's gotta do." The same words his father had used to justify selling drugs. To justify abandoning them. 9:52 p.m. Michael moved to the bread aisle, closer to the back door. His empty backpack hung heavy on his shoulders. Just food, he told himself. Just enough to feed Sarah for a few days until he found more work. 9:55 p.m. Joey stretched, yawned, and pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket. "Hey, Mrs. Chun, almost done?" "5 more minutes," came the reply from the produce section. The bell above the door chimed as Joey stepped out. Michael counted his heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. He moved fast, hands grabbing what they could reach. Spaghetti, sauce, ground beef from the cooler, bread, peanut butter, a bag of apples. Each item felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The back door was 10 steps away. 9, 8. Hey. Michael froze. Mrs. Chun stood at the end of the aisle, a head of lettuce clutched to her chest. "Stop! Thief!" Michael ran. The back door slammed against the wall as he burst into the alley. Cold night air hit his lungs like needles. Behind him, he heard Joey shouting, feet pounding on pavement. Left at the corner, 2 blocks to home. His backpack bounced against his spine, the food inside shifting with each step. Footsteps getting closer. "Stop right there!" A police siren wailed in the distance. Michael's legs burned. 1 more block. Just 1 more. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. Concrete scraped his cheek as Joey tackled him from behind. The backpack ripped open, cans of sauce rolling across the sidewalk. "Thought you could run, huh?" Joey's knee pressed into Michael's back. "Not so smart now, are you?" Red and blue lights painted the walls. Car doors slammed. "Please," Michael gasped. "My sister Dash." Hands behind your back, a new voice commanded. Cold metal closed around his wrists. The officers hauled him to his feet. His stolen food lay scattered across the ground, the spaghetti box crushed, sauce leaking from a dented can. "Michael Johnson?" One officer read from his ID. "You're under arrest for theft and resisting arrest." The police car's back seat smelled like sweat and disinfectant. Through the window, Michael watched his neighborhood slide by. The market, the construction site where he'd begged for work, the playground where Sarah liked to swing. "Sarah." "Officer." Michael leaned forward. "Please, I need to call someone. My sister's home alone. You can make your call at the station." The booking room was too bright, too loud. They took his shoelaces, his belt, the quarter from his pocket. His fingerprints left black smudges on white cards. 1 phone call, the desk sergeant said, pushing a landline toward him. Michael's fingers shook as he dialed Mrs. Peterson's number. Sarah had brought it home months ago, just in case. 1 ring, 2 rings. "Hello, Mrs. Peterson? This is Michael Johnson, Sarah's brother." A pause. "Michael? It's almost 11 o'clock. I know. I'm sorry, but..." His voice cracked. "I'm in trouble. Sarah's alone at the apartment. Could you? Where are you?" "Central Station. They arrested me for..." The words stuck in his throat. "Please just check on Sarah." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll go right now. Should I call social services?" "No." The word exploded from him. "Please, no. Just stay with her until I figure something out. Michael Dash, promise me. Please." Mrs. Peterson sighed. "I promise. For tonight." The cell was 8 feet by 10 feet. A metal toilet in the corner. A concrete bench along one wall. Michael sat with his head in his hands, listening to the sounds of the drunk tank down the hall. "Johnson," a guard's voice echoed. "Visitor." The interview room was even smaller than the cell. A social worker sat across the table, a folder open in front of her. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Ms. Reynolds from Child Protective Services." She had tired eyes and careful handwriting. "We need to discuss Sarah's placement. She's fine with Mrs. Peterson. For tonight, yes. But given your situation..." Michael's fists clenched under the table. "My situation? You're 18, unemployed, facing criminal charges. Your apartment has no food, minimal utilities. Sarah shows signs of malnutrition." Ms. Reynolds flipped through her papers. "We have concerns. She's my sister, and you've done your best. But sometimes love isn't enough. Love isn't enough." The same words the doctor had used when Mom was dying, when the treatment costs mounted and the insurance ran out. "There's a good foster home in Berkeley," Ms. Reynolds continued. "A stable family, other children her age." "No." Michael stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "You're not taking her. Mr. Johnson, please sit down. She's all I have left." "Guard," Ms. Reynolds called out. "We're done here." Back in his cell, Michael pressed his forehead against the cold concrete wall. The first hints of dawn crept through the high window, painting the cell in shades of gray. Across town, in Mrs. Peterson's spare bedroom, Sarah lay awake, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. Her teacher's words echoed in her head. "Your brother's in some trouble, sweetie. But we'll figure it out." The rabbit's fur was damp with tears as Sarah whispered into the darkness, "Please come back, Michael. Please come back." Morning brought harsh fluorescent lights and the clang of cell doors. Michael's court-appointed lawyer arrived with coffee breath and a wrinkled suit. Shoplifting resisting arrest. He flipped through the paperwork. First offense, but with a family history. What about my family history? The lawyer Stevens, his name tag read, sighed. "Your father's doing 10 years for drug distribution. That kind of thing makes judges nervous. I'm not my father. No, but you're his son. And now you're in his old cell block." Stevens closed the file. "The DA's offering 6 months if you plead guilty." Given the circumstances, 6 months? Michael's voice cracked. "What happens to Sarah? That's not my department. But CPS usually no." Michael stood up. "No plea. I want a trial." Stevens rubbed his temples. "Look, kid, I get it. You want to be there for your sister. But right now, you're looking at making things worse. I don't care. I'm not letting them take her." The holding cell before court was packed with other defendants. Michael sat in the corner, listening to their whispered conversations. Drug charges. Assault. DUI. Their voices blended together until a guard called his name. The courtroom smelled like wood polish and stale coffee. Michael's handcuffs clinked as he walked to the defendant's table. The judge, an older man with steel gray hair, barely looked up from his papers. "Michael Johnson. Case number 2025, CR 1892. Charges are theft under $500 and resisting arrest. How do you plead?" Before Michael could answer, the courtroom doors burst open. "Michael!" Sarah's voice cut through the formal silence. "Michael, don't let them take me." She ran down the center aisle, her blue dress flying behind her, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Peterson followed, trying to catch her. "Order!" The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court." But Sarah had already reached the barrier, her small hands gripping the wooden rail. "Please, don't take my brother away. Please." The courtroom fell silent except for Sarah's sobs. Michael's heart shattered as he watched the bailiff gently pull her back. In that moment, as his little sister's cries echoed off the high ceiling, Michael realized that everything had changed. The simple act of trying to feed his sister had set in motion events he couldn't control. The judge's gavel came down again. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet courtroom. "Clear the court," he ordered. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour." As they led Michael back to the holding cell, he caught one last glimpse of Sarah being carried out by Mrs. Peterson. Her blue dress was wrinkled, her pigtails coming undone. She looked so small, so fragile, so alone. The fluorescent lights at Oakland Children's Center buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the industrial carpet. Sarah sat cross-legged on a narrow bed, still wearing her blue dress from court. She hadn't touched the sandwich Ms. Reynolds had left 3 hours ago. "Sarah?" A staff member knocked on the door frame. "It's dinner time. The other kids are waiting." Sarah didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the window, watching the sun sink behind the city skyline. The same sun Michael could see from his cell. "You need to eat something, honey?" "I'm not hungry." The words came out as a whisper. But she was hungry. The kind of hungry that made her stomach feel like it was eating itself. The kind of hungry she'd gotten used to at home. But this wasn't home. And Michael wasn't here to split his portion with her when the hunger got too bad. Down the hall, she could hear other kids laughing in the cafeteria. The smell of meatloaf drifted under the door. Her stomach growled, but she wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "Sarah." Ms. Reynolds appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of professional concern. "You haven't eaten since you arrived. If this continues, we'll have to take you to the doctor." Sarah's fingers clutched the worn fabric of her dress. "I want my brother." "Your brother is in a lot of trouble right now." Ms. Reynolds sat on the edge of the bed. "He can't take care of you anymore." "Yes, he can." Sarah's voice cracked. "He always takes care of me." "By stealing?" "By letting you go hungry." Ms. Reynolds pulled out a thick folder. "Do you know how many times your teachers reported concerns?" How many times they saw you sleeping in class, wearing the same clothes? Tears burned in Sarah's eyes. He tries really hard. I know he does, sweetie, but trying isn't enough. Across town, in the county courthouse holding cell, Michael sat with his head against the concrete wall. His court-appointed lawyer, Stevens, shuffled through papers on the other side of the bars. The preliminary hearing is tomorrow, Stevens said without looking up. The DA's still offering 6 months with the plea deal. And Sarah? Stevens sighed. CPS filed their report this morning. It's not good. What does that mean? It means they're pushing for permanent removal. Stevens finally met Michael's eyes. They have documentation going back months. Teachers, reports, medical records, your apartment's condition. Michael's fist clenched. I did everything I could. Sometimes everything isn't don't. Michael's voice was sharp. Don't say it isn't enough. Stevens closed his folder. The hearing's at 9. Try to get some sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Michael lay on the thin mattress, memories playing behind his closed eyes. Mom in her hospital bed, skin yellow with jaundice, making him promise to take care of Sarah. Dad being led away in handcuffs, not even looking back at his children. Sarah's face this morning, tear-stained and terrified. The next morning, the courtroom felt colder. Michael sat beside Stevens, wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman named Martinez, arranged papers at her table. All rise, the bailiff called. The Honorable Judge Harrison presiding. The judge settled into his chair, glasses perched on his nose. Are both parties ready to proceed? Yes, Your Honor. Martinez stood. The state calls Ms. Janet Reynolds. The social worker took the stand, smoothing her skirt. She looked different under the courtroom lights, more severe, more certain. Ms. Reynolds, Martinez began, please describe the conditions you found during your home visits to the Johnson residence. The apartment was severely neglected. No proper food storage, minimal furniture, evidence of pest infestation. The children were sleeping on mattresses on the floor. And Sarah's physical condition? Signs of malnutrition. Her teachers reported she often fell asleep in class, appeared unwashed, wore ill-fitting clothes. During my last visit, there was no food in the apartment except half a loaf of bread and some condiments. Michael gripped the edge of the table. Every word was true, and every truth felt like a knife. And the defendant's employment status? Sporadic at best. No steady income. No health insurance. The rent was consistently late. Stevens stood for cross-examination. Ms. Reynolds, in your observations, did you ever see signs that Michael was abusive or deliberately neglectful? No. But did Sarah ever express fear of her brother? No, quite the opposite. And did you offer any assistance? Food stamps, housing aid, job placement? Ms. Reynolds shifted in her seat. There are programs available, but Mr. Johnson never applied because he was too busy working whatever jobs he could find to feed his sister. Isn't that right? Objection, Martinez called. Argumentative, sustained. The morning dragged on. More witnesses took the stand. Teachers, neighbors, the landlord. Each one painted a picture of failure, of a boy trying to be a man and falling short. During a brief recess, Stevens pulled Michael aside. The judge is going to make his ruling on custody this afternoon. We need Sarah to testify. Michael's stomach dropped. No, I don't want her in here again. She's our best chance. The judge needs to see what? Her crying? Begging? Michael's voice cracked. She's been through enough. Back at the Children's Center, Sarah sat in the counselor's office, picking at a loose thread on her dress. The counselor, a young woman named Amy, pushed a box of crayons across the desk. Would you like to draw while we talk? Sarah shook her head. Okay. Can you tell me about your brother? Sarah's fingers twisted in her lap. He takes care of me? How does he take care of you? Sarah's voice wavered. He makes sure I eat first. He walks me to school even when he's really tired. He reads me stories even though we don't have many books. What about when there's no food? He goes hungry, so I can eat. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. He thinks I don't know, but I do. Amy made a note in her file. And your parents? Mom died. Sarah's voice got very small. Dad left. That must have been hard. Sarah's hands balled into fists. Michael stayed. Michael always stays. The afternoon session began with Martinez's closing argument. She stood before the judge, her voice sharp and certain. Your Honor, the state has demonstrated a clear pattern of neglect. While the defendant's intentions may be admirable, the fact remains that he is unable to provide adequate care for his sister. The child is malnourished, living in substandard conditions, and at risk. We ask the court to grant permanent custody to Child Protective Services. Stevens rose next, his tie slightly crooked. Your Honor, what we've heard today isn't a story of neglect. It's a story of sacrifice. My client has done everything humanly possible to keep his family together after unimaginable tragedy. He works multiple jobs, goes without food himself, and provides the one thing Sarah needs most: love and stability. The judge listened, his face impassive. When both lawyers finished, he looked directly at Michael. Mr. Johnson, do you have anything to add before I make my ruling? Michael stood, his handcuffs clinking. Your Honor, I know I'm not perfect. I know we don't have much. But Sarah, his voice caught. Sarah is everything to me. She's all I have left of our family. Please, don't take her away. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then the judge picked up his gavel. Based on the evidence presented, I find that the current living situation presents an immediate risk to the minor child's welfare. Temporary custody is granted to Child Protective Services pending the resolution of the criminal charges. Furthermore, the rest of the words faded into white noise. Michael felt the room tilt sideways. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Stevens saying something about appeals, about options. But there were no options left. The system had spoken. Sarah would be taken away. And Michael had failed the only promise that ever mattered. The sun was setting over Oakland as the transport van took Michael back to the county jail. In the children's center across town, Sarah pressed her hand against the window, watching the same sun disappear. Two siblings, separated by miles and metal bars, connected only by the fading light and the echo of a promise broken by circumstance. The night settled over the city like a heavy blanket, bringing no comfort to either of them. In his cell, Michael stared at the ceiling, knowing that somewhere out there, Sarah was doing the same. Tomorrow would bring more hearings, more decisions, more pieces of their lives being carved away by people with good intentions and legal papers. But tonight, in the darkness, they were both just lost children, waiting for a dawn that offered no hope. The moonlight cut through the barred windows of Oakland Children's Center, casting shadows across Sarah's bed. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. 3 days since they'd taken her from Michael. 3 days of picked-at meals and sleepless nights. Sarah slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. The night staff would be changing shifts soon. She'd watch their routine, just like Michael had taught her. Always know your surroundings, bud. Knowledge is power. Her backpack was ready under the bed, stuffed with her blue dress and the photo of Mom she'd managed to keep. The worn rabbit tucked under her arm was coming too. No way she'd leave Charlie behind. The hallway stretched long and dark ahead of her. One guard at the front desk, usually dozing by this hour. Emergency exit at the back, alarm disabled for maintenance. She'd heard the janitor complaining about it yesterday. Sarah counted her steps. 20 to the water fountain. Pause. Listen. 10 more to the corner. The guard's snores echoed softly from the front desk. Almost there. The exit sign glowed red in the darkness. 5 more steps. A floorboard creaked. Sarah? Ms. Reynolds' voice cut through the silence. What are you doing up? Sarah ran. The emergency door slammed against the wall as she burst into the night air. Concrete scraped her feet as she sprinted across the parking lot. Sarah, stop! Footsteps behind her. Adult footsteps, getting closer. Sarah's lungs burned. She wasn't as fast as Michael. Wasn't as strong. Hands caught her shoulders, lifted her off the ground. Sarah kicked and screamed, Charlie the rabbit falling to the pavement. No! Let me go! I want my brother. Sarah, stop. Ms. Reynolds held her tight. You'll hurt yourself. I don't care. I want Michael. Other staff members appeared, summoned by the noise. They carried her back inside as she thrashed and sobbed. Charlie lay forgotten in the parking lot, collecting dew under the streetlights. Across town in the county jail, Michael sat in the interview room, listening to Stevens outline their options. The prosecution's case is strong, Stevens said, spreading papers across the table. Security footage shows you entering the store, the stolen goods were recovered, and you ran from the scene. What about Sarah's testimony? Michael leaned forward. If the judge heard Dash, the DA will object. She's too young, too emotionally involved. Stevens rubbed his temples. And after her outburst in court, she was scared. She was disruptive. Judge Harrison doesn't like disruptions. A guard knocked on the door. Time's up. Michael stood, the chains on his ankles rattling. Get her back on the stand. Please. Michael. Stevens gathered his papers. Sometimes we have to know when to fold. The holding cell felt smaller each time they brought him back. Michael paced the length of it, 6 steps one way, 6 steps back. Like the apartment. Like the space between his bed and Sarah's. Johnson. A guard appeared. Your social worker's here? Ms. Reynolds looked tired, her usually neat hair escaping its clip. She sat across from Michael, pulling out her ever-present folder. Sarah tried to run away last night. Michael's heart stopped. Is she Dash? She's fine. Scared, angry, but physically fine. Ms. Reynolds opened the folder. This is why we need to discuss permanent placement options. No. Michael, be reasonable. She needs stability, proper care. Dash. She needs her brother. Michael's voice echoed off the concrete walls. She needs the only family she has left. Family isn't always what's best. Ms. Reynolds pulled out a document. There's a couple in Berkeley. Good neighborhood, good schools. They're willing to take her immediately. Michael stared at the paper. Pictures of a beautiful house, a manicured lawn, a smiling couple with perfect teeth and clean clothes. Everything he couldn't give Sarah. No. He pushed the paper away. I won't sign it. You don't have a choice anymore. Ms. Reynolds' voice hardened. The judge already granted temporary custody. This is just a courtesy notification. The courtroom the next morning was packed. Word had gotten out about the case. The homeless teenager trying to keep his sister, the desperate theft, the emotional scenes. Local news cameras waited outside. Michael sat beside Stevens, trying to focus as character witnesses took the stand. His former high school principal, the neighbor who'd sometimes watch Sarah, each one painting a picture of a boy in over his head. The state calls Mrs. Linda Peterson. Sarah's teacher walked to the stand, her sensible shoes clicking on the polished floor. She looked different outside the classroom, older, more serious. Mrs. Peterson, Martinez began, how long have you known the defendant and his sister? Since September, when Sarah joined my class. And what were your observations of Sarah's condition during this time? Mrs. Peterson glanced at Michael. She often came to school hungry, tired, sometimes wearing the same clothes several days in a row. Did you report these concerns? Yes, several times. And did you ever provide food for Sarah? Objection. Stevens stood. Relevance? Goes to the pattern of neglect, Your Honor. Overruled. The witness may answer. Mrs. Peterson's hands twisted in her lap. Yes, I kept extra food in my desk. For Sarah and other students in need. Martinez nodded. No further questions. Stevens approached the stand. Mrs. Peterson, in your experience as a teacher, have you ever had students from wealthy families come to school hungry? Objection. Speculation. I'll rephrase. Stevens adjusted his tie. Mrs. Peterson, is hunger always a sign of neglect? No. Mrs. Peterson sat straighter. Sometimes it's a sign of poverty. Sometimes it's a sign of a system that fails families. And in your observation, was Michael neglectful of his sister? Or was he doing his best in an impossible situation? Objection. Calls for conclusion. Sustained. Stevens changed tactics. Mrs. Peterson, did Sarah ever express fear of her brother? Never. She loves him deeply. And when she stayed with you the night of Michael's arrest, did she ask for anything specific? Mrs. Peterson's voice softened. She asked me to promise not to let them take her away from him. The morning dragged on. More witnesses. More evidence of their poverty, their struggles, their failures. Michael felt each word like a physical blow. During the lunch recess, Stevens pulled him aside. The court-appointed psychologist is next. Dr. Warner interviewed Sarah yesterday. Michael's stomach nodded. What did she say? I don't know. But Michael. Stevens lowered his voice. If she recommends separation, given everything else. The afternoon session began with Dr. Warner on the stand. She was younger than Michael expected, with kind eyes behind steel-rimmed glasses. Dr. Warner, Martinez began, please share your professional observations of Sarah Johnson. Sarah presents as a bright, emotionally attached 8-year-old suffering from anxiety and signs of food insecurity. She shows strong attachment to her brother, but also exhibits symptoms of parentification, taking on adult worries and responsibilities beyond her years. And in your professional opinion, is this environment healthy for her development? Dr. Warner paused. Sarah's situation is complex. While the material conditions of her life are certainly concerning, her emotional bond with her brother provides significant psychological stability. But is that bond worth the cost of her physical well-being? Objection. Stevens stood. Argumentative. Sustained. Martinez tried again. Dr. Warner, would Sarah's interests be better served in a stable foster home? Another pause. Statistically, children do better with family, even in imperfect conditions. The trauma of separation often outweighs material improvements. Michael felt a tiny spark of hope, but Martinez wasn't finished. And when that family can't provide basic necessities, when that family resorts to crime? Objection. Withdrawn, Martinez turned to the judge. No further questions. The sun was setting when Judge Harrison called a recess until morning. Michael watched the courtroom empty, his chest tight with fear. In the children's center, Sarah sat by the window, holding Charlie the rabbit. They'd found him in the parking lot, wet with dew, but otherwise okay. Like her, he was a survivor. Sarah? Amy, the counselor, appeared in the doorway. Dr. Warner said, you did really well in your session yesterday. Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the darkening sky. Would you like to draw? Or maybe we could read a story? I want to see my brother. Amy sighed. I know you do, sweetie. But right now, he reads better stories. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. He does all the voices right. In his cell, Michael lay on his bunk, remembering all the stories he'd read to Sarah. The Warren Library books. The fairy tales memorized when they couldn't afford books. The made-up adventures on nights when the hunger kept them awake. Now their story was being written by others. People with degrees and titles and good intentions. People who saw their poverty but missed their love. People who could give Sarah everything except the one thing she needed most. The night settled over Oakland, bringing no answers. In 2 different buildings, brother and sister watched the same stars through different windows, both knowing that tomorrow would decide everything, and neither knowing if their next chapter would be written together or apart. The interview room at the Oakland Children's Center felt smaller today. Sarah sat across from Amy, the counselor, watching sunlight dance on the linoleum floor. A tape recorder sat between them, its red light blinking. Sarah, Amy began gently. Can you tell me about your mom? Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the table. She used to sing when she cooked. What did she cook? Spaghetti? Sarah's voice caught. With real meatballs. And when Dad came home from work, he'd pick me up and spin me around, and Michael would set the table. When did things change? Sarah's hands stilled. Dad started coming home late. Sometimes not at all. Mom cried a lot. Then the police came and took Dad away. And then, Mom got sick. Sarah's words came out in a whisper. She couldn't cook anymore. Couldn't sing. Michael did everything. Amy leaned forward. Everything. He dropped out of school to work. Made sure I got to school. Helped Mom take her medicine. Tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks. He held her hand when she died. The tape recorder words softly, capturing every word. In his cell, Michael sat on the thin mattress, holding a crumpled envelope. Inside was a letter he'd found in Mom's things after she died. One he'd never had the courage to read. Dear Michael and Sarah, it began in Mom's shaky handwriting. If you're reading this, I'm gone. There's so much I need to say. Michael's vision blurred as he read, Michael, my brave boy. You've carried so much on your young shoulders. The day your father was arrested, I saw you become a man at 14. You never complained, never broke, even when I got sick. You're stronger than your father ever was. Sarah, my sweet girl, your smile kept me going through the darkest days. Promise me you'll keep smiling. And Michael, promise me you'll protect that smile. There's money hidden in the blue cookie jar, my secret savings. Not much, but enough to help. And Michael, remember, you're not alone. Mrs. Chun at the market, she knew your father before the drugs. She promised to help if you ever needed it. I'm sorry I'm leaving you both. Sorry I couldn't fix what your father broke. Sorry I got sick. But Michael, you're not him. You never were. You're the best of both of us. Take care of each other. Love, Mom. The paper shook in Michael's hands. The blue cookie jar. He'd never looked inside. Had never wanted to disturb Mom's things. And Mrs. Chun. The same Mrs. Chun who'd caught him stealing. Guards! His voice cracked. I need to make a call. Across town, in the bustling Martinez market, Mrs. Chun was restocking shelves when her phone rang. Mrs. Chun? This is Michael Johnson. Silence filled the line. Maria's boy? Her accent was thick with emotion. The one who tried to steal from you. Yes. Michael's throat tight. I found a letter from my mom. She said you knew my father. Before. A long pause. Your father was a good man once. Helped me when kids broke my window. Then the drugs. She sighed. Your mother made me promise to watch out for you. I failed. No, I failed. I should have asked for help. Come see me when this is over. We talk. Back at the Children's Center, Sarah sat in the classroom, staring at a blank piece of paper. Her classmates from school had sent cards, bright crayon drawings, and carefully printed messages. We miss you, Sarah. Come back soon. Mr. Whiskers, the class hamster, isn't the same without you. Maya, her best friend, had written a whole page. Dear Sarah, Mom says you're in a special place because your brother is in trouble. But I told her he's not bad. I told her about the time he gave me his umbrella when it was raining, even though he got all wet, and how he always lets you have the bigger half of the sandwich. Mom cried when I told her. I don't know why grown-ups cry so much. I miss you. Love, Maya. Sarah picked up a crayon and began to write. Dear Judge, my brother is not bad. He's like a superhero, but without a cape. He works really hard and sometimes he's so tired he falls asleep in his clothes. But he always reads me a story first. He thinks I don't know, but I see him give me the bigger pieces of food. I see him count pennies at night. I hear him cry sometimes when he thinks I'm sleeping. Please don't take him away. He's all I have left. From Sarah Johnson. Amy found the letter later, carefully folded on Sarah's bed. Reading it, she made a decision. The courthouse was quiet when Amy arrived with the letter and the tape. Stevens met her in the hallway. I shouldn't be doing this, Amy said, handing him the envelope. But that little girl's voice needs to be heard. Stevens read the letter, then listened to the tape. His tired eyes lit up. This changes things. He checked his watch. The judge needs to see this before tomorrow's session. In his chambers, Judge Harrison removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. The letter lay on his desk beside the transcript of Sarah's recorded conversation. It's irregular, he told Stevens. The child's testimony was ruled inadmissible. This isn't testimony, Your Honor. This is a little girl's truth. The judge picked up the letter again, reading Sarah's careful printing. Morning brought a fresh wave of anxiety. Michael sat in the holding cell, waiting for court to begin. Stevens had visited earlier, a new energy in his step. Something's changed, he'd said. The judge was up half the night reviewing new evidence. What evidence? You'll see. The courtroom filled slowly. Michael noticed Amy sitting in the back row, next to Mrs. Chun from the market. Mrs. Peterson came in with a stack of papers, what looked like children's drawings. Judge Harrison entered, his face unreadable. Before we continue, I've spent considerable time reviewing additional materials submitted to this court. Ms. Martinez, are you familiar with these documents? The prosecutor stood. No, Your Honor. Then I suggest you review them. We'll recess for 1 hour. In the Children's Center, Sarah sat with Charlie the rabbit, watching the clock. Amy had told her something important was happening today, but wouldn't say what. Sarah? Ms. Reynolds appeared in the doorway. There's someone here to see you. Maya burst into the room, pigtails flying. Sarah, Mom said I could visit. The girls hugged, both talking at once. Maya's mother stood in the doorway, wiping her eyes. I brought you something. Maya pulled out a familiar blue cookie jar. Mrs. Chun found it in your apartment. She said it was your mom's. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a stack of $20 bills and a note. For my children's future. When court resumed, the mood had shifted. Martinez looked shaken as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, in light of new evidence, the state wishes to revise its position. While we maintain that the defendant's actions were criminal, we believe alternative sentencing could better serve justice in this case. Judge Harrison nodded. And the custody recommendation? Martinez glanced at her notes. Given the extraordinary circumstances and the clear bond between the siblings, we withdraw our petition for permanent removal. Michael's heart stopped. Stevens squeezed his shoulder. Mr. Stevens? The judge turned to the defense. Your response? We thank the state for their reconsideration. Stevens stood. And we have one more piece of evidence to present. Mrs. Chun? The elderly store owner walked to the front of the courtroom, carrying a manila envelope. These are employment papers, Your Honor. A full-time position at my market with benefits, starting as soon as Mr. Johnson's case is resolved. The judge reviewed the papers. Then he looked at Michael. Mr. Johnson, stand please. Michael rose on shaky legs. I've been a judge for 23 years. I've seen countless cases of family tragedy, of poverty's brutal choices. What I see here is not a criminal, but a brother who lost his way trying to protect the only family he has left. The judge picked up Sarah's letter. Your sister wrote that you're a superhero without a cape. Perhaps it's time we help you be the hero she needs. Legally this time. Hope, dangerous and fragile, bloomed in Michael's chest. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. There would be conditions to meet, supervision to endure, trust to rebuild. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, both brother and sister slept peacefully, knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, the truth was enough to change everything. Dawn broke over Oakland Children's Center, painting Sarah's room in shades of gold. She stood before the small mirror, watching Amy fix the bow in her hair. The blue dress, freshly washed and pressed, hung neat and crisp against her skin. Are you nervous? Amy asked, adjusting the ribbon. Sarah's fingers twisted in the fabric. What if I say something wrong? Just tell the truth. Amy turned her around, smoothing the dress. That's all anyone wants to hear. But Sarah's stomach churned. She'd heard the whispers between staff members. Today was important. Today was her chance to keep Michael, or lose him forever. Down the hall, Ms. Reynolds paced in her office, phone pressed to her ear. Yes, Your Honor. I understand it's irregular. Yes, she's ready. No signs of coaching. She hung up, rubbing her temples. In 30 years of social work, she'd never seen a case like this. Never seen a judge change course so dramatically. Never seen a community rally around a family quite this way. Ms. Reynolds? Amy stood in the doorway. The car's ready. In the county jail, Michael sat on his bunk, wearing the suit Mrs. Chun had brought, his father's old one, found in the back of their closet. It hung loose on his frame, smelling faintly of mothballs and memories. Looking sharp, Johnson. The guard appeared with Stevens. Time ago, the lawyer carried a thick folder and a determined expression. Remember what we discussed. Let Sarah speak freely. Don't react too strongly, no matter what she says. The judge will be watching you as much as her. Michael nodded, his throat too tight for words. In his pocket, his mother's letter crinkled, a reminder of promises made and kept. The courthouse steps were crowded. Local news vans lined the street, reporters clutching microphones and coffee cups. The story had caught fire. 2 orphan siblings fighting to stay together, a community coming to their aid. Michael! Mrs. Chun waved from the entrance. She'd closed the market for the morning. Her closed for family emergency sign drawing knowing nods from regular customers. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Mrs. Peterson arrived with a stack of letters from Sarah's classmates. Maya and her mother sat in the front row, beside other neighbors who'd brought groceries, offered rides, watched Sarah when Michael worked. All rise! Judge Harrison entered, his face grave. Before we begin, let me be clear. Today's proceedings are highly unusual. I've agreed to hear the child's direct testimony based on compelling new evidence and community input. However, he looked directly at the gallery. Any disruption will result in immediate removal. Is that understood? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Very well. Ms. Reynolds, please bring in Sarah Johnson. The door opened. Sarah stepped in, her small hand clutched in Amy's. The blue dress seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, making her look younger, more vulnerable. Michael's heart clenched. She'd lost weight in the weeks they'd been apart. Her cheekbones stood out sharper, her eyes too big in her thin face. Sarah. Judge Harrison's voice softened. Please come forward. She walked to the front, her shoes clicking on the polished floor. Amy helped her into the witness chair, adjusting the microphone. Now, Sarah, do you understand why you're here today? Sarah's eyes found Michael. He tried to smile, to give her strength. I'm here to tell the truth about my brother. That's right. And do you understand what truth means? It means... Sarah's voice wavered. It means saying what really happened, not what people want to hear. The judge nodded. Very good. Are you ready to begin? Sarah's hands gripped the chair. Yes, Sir. Martinez stood first, her usual sharp demeanor softened. Sarah, can you tell us about living with your brother? He takes care of me? Sarah's voice grew stronger. He makes sure I go to school and do my homework. He cooks when we have food. He reads me stories even when he's really tired. And when there isn't food? Sarah's chin lifted. He goes hungry, so I can eat. He thinks I don't know, but I do. I see him give me the bigger pieces. I hear his stomach growl at night. In the gallery, Maya's mother wiped her eyes. Mrs. Chen reached for her handkerchief. Sarah, Martinez continued, don't you think you'd be better off in a home with plenty of food? With new clothes, in your own room? Sarah's eyes flashed. Better for who? Objection. Stephen stood. Argumentative. I'll rephrase. Martinez adjusted her approach. Sarah, what would you say to people who think your brother can't take care of you properly? I'd say they're wrong. Sarah's voice rang clear. Michael does everything he can. He works really hard. It's not his fault we don't have much money. It's not his fault Mom died and Dad went away. The courtroom fell silent. Even the reporters stopped scribbling. When Mom was sick, Sarah continued unprompted. Michael learned to give her medicine. He helped her walk to the bathroom. He held her hand when she was scared. He was only 14, but he did everything the doctor said. Michael blinked back tears, remembering those long nights. The beeping machines, the smell of antiseptic, the weight of responsibility crushing his teenage shoulders. And after she died, Martinez asked softly. He didn't cry in front of me. He made sure I ate and went to school. He got jobs, lots of different jobs. Sometimes he came home so tired he fell asleep in his clothes. But he always tucked me in first. Stephen stood for his questions. Sarah, what happened the night Michael was arrested? Sarah's hands twisted in her dress. We didn't have any food. I was really hungry. Michael looked scared. He left after I went to bed. When the police brought him back, he was crying. He kept saying he was sorry. Sorry for what? For not being good enough. Sarah's voice cracked. But he is good enough. He's the best brother in the world. He's all I have left. The judge leaned forward. Sarah, if you could tell this court one thing about your brother, what would it be? Sarah straightened in her chair, her eyes finding Michael's again. He's not like our dad. Dad left us. Michael stays. He always stays. In the defendant's chair, Michael fought to keep his composure. Every word hit like a physical blow, not from pain, but from the pure, unfiltered love in his sister's voice. Thank you, Sarah. The judge's voice was gentle. You may step down. Amy came forward to escort her out, but Sarah hesitated. Your Honor, can I say one more thing? Go ahead. Please don't take my brother away. Her voice trembled. He's not just my brother. He's my hero. The gallery erupted in muffled sobs. Mrs. Peterson hugged Maya's mother. Mrs. Chun dabbed at her eyes. Order, the judge called softly. We'll recess for lunch. Court resumes at 2 o'clock. As Sarah walked past the defense table, Michael reached out. Their fingers brushed, the first contact in weeks. Her small hand was warm, real alive. I love you, Bug, he whispered. Love you too, Michael. The door closed behind her. Michael sat back, his father's suit suddenly feeling less like a burden and more like armor. For the first time since his arrest, he felt something like hope. In her office, Martinez stared at her case notes. The facts hadn't changed: the poverty, the stealing, the neglect charges. But facts, she was learning, didn't always tell the whole story. Judge Harrison sat in his chambers, reading through Sarah's letter again. 23 years on the bench had taught him to see beyond the surface, to find truth in the spaces between official reports and legal arguments. And sometimes, he realized, truth wore a blue dress and spoke with the unshakable faith of a child who knew, beyond any doubt, that love was stronger than circumstance. The afternoon session would bring more testimony, more arguments, more legal frameworks trying to contain a situation that defied easy categorization. But in the quiet of midday, as sunlight streamed through courthouse windows, something had shifted. Something fundamental had changed. A little girl had spoken her truth. And sometimes, just sometimes, truth was enough to move mountains. Or at least, enough to move the heart of a judge. The afternoon sun streamed through the high courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Sarah stood outside the courtroom doors, her small hand gripping Amy's tightly. The morning session had been just practice. Now came the real test. Remember, Amy knelt before her, straightening Sarah's blue bow. Just speak from your heart. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight for words. Through the heavy doors, she could hear the shuffle of papers, the murmur of voices, the quiet cough of the bailiff. Inside, Michael sat at the defense table, his borrowed suit feeling heavier by the minute. Stevens had briefed him during lunch. This is it. Everything hinges on Sarah's testimony. The doors opened. Sarah stepped through, chin high despite her trembling hands. The crowd seemed bigger now, the ceiling higher, the judge's bench looming like a mountain before her. All rise, the bailiff called. This court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Harrison presiding. Sarah's shoes squeaked on the polished floor as she walked forward. She caught glimpses of familiar faces. Mrs. Chun dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Mrs. Peterson holding a stack of papers. Maya giving her a tiny wave. Sarah Johnson. Judge Harrison's voice was gentle but firm. Please approach the bench. She climbed into the witness chair, her feet dangling inches above the floor. The microphone stood before her like a strange metal flower. Sarah, the judge leaned forward slightly. Do you remember our conversation this morning about telling the truth? Yes, sir, her voice came out as a whisper. And, do you still want to speak to the court about your brother? Sarah's eyes found Michael. He looked smaller in the big suit, tired and scared. But when their eyes met, he gave her the same smile he always had, the one that meant everything would be okay. Yes, sir, I need to. Judge Harrison nodded. Ms. Martinez, you may begin. The prosecutor stood, her sharp heels clicking against the floor. But when she spoke, her voice was softer than before. Sarah, can you tell us about a typical day with your brother? Sarah's fingers twisted in her dress. Michael wakes me up at 6:30. He makes sure I brush my teeth and get dressed. Sometimes, she hesitated, sometimes we don't have hot water, so he heats water on the hot plate for me to wash. Go on. He walks me to school, even when he's really tired from working late. He always makes sure I have my homework done. When we have food, he packs me lunch. When we don't, her voice caught. When we don't, he says he forgot, but I know he's lying. He just wants me to eat the school lunch instead. In the gallery, Mrs. Peterson wiped her eyes. She thought of all the times she'd found Sarah sleeping in class, all the lunches she'd quietly provided. After school, Sarah continued, Michael picks me up if he's not working. If he is, Mrs. Chun from the market watches me. She helps me with homework and gives me crackers. Mrs. Chun nodded, her weathered face streaked with tears. And in the evenings, Martinez prompted. Michael makes dinner if we have food. He lets me help sometimes, but he's careful with the hot plate because we can't afford to buy a new one. After dinner, he helps me with homework. Then, Sarah smiled slightly. Then he reads me stories. Even when you don't have books, he makes them up. Sarah's voice grew stronger. Stories about princesses who save themselves, about brothers and sisters who stick together no matter what. Sometimes, when I'm really hungry and can't sleep, he tells stories until I forget about being hungry Michael pressed his hands against his thighs, fighting to keep still. Every word was a knife, cutting through the layers of shame and fear he'd built around their life. Sarah, Martinez's voice remained gentle. Why did your brother steal food that night? Stevens half rose to object, but Judge Harrison waved him down. Sarah's chin lifted. Because I was hungry. Because he couldn't watch me be hungry anymore. Because... Her voice cracked. Because he's not like our dad. Dad left us. Michael stays. He always stays. The courtroom fell silent. Even the reporters stopped writing, their pens hovering above their notepads. And if the court decides to place you in foster care? Martinez asked. With a family that can provide regular meals, new clothes, your own room? Sarah's hands gripped the witness stand. Then you might as well lock me up with Michael, because I'll run away. I'll run away every single time until I find him again. A murmur ran through the gallery. Judge Harrison tapped his gavel once, gently. Ms. Martinez, do you have any further questions? No, Your Honor. Stevens stood for cross-examination. Sarah, has your brother ever hurt you? Never. The word rang out clear and strong. Has he ever yelled at you? Made you feel afraid? Only when I tried to cross the street without looking. A small smile crossed her face. He said his heart nearly stopped. When your mother was sick, what did Michael do? Sarah's smile faded. He took care of both of us. He learned all her medicines, which ones for morning, which ones for night. He helped her walk to the bathroom when she was too weak. Her voice caught. He held her hand when she was scared. He was scared too, but he never showed it. And after she passed, he made sure I ate before he did. He worked any job he could find. Sarah's voice strengthened. He became my mom and dad and brother all at once. He's everything I have left. Stevens nodded. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Harrison looked at Sarah. Young lady, is there anything else you'd like to tell this court? Sarah stood up in the witness box, her blue dress catching the afternoon light. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the courtroom. My brother is not a bad person. He's the best person I know. He works so hard, but sometimes hard work isn't enough. Sometimes, she looked at Michael, tears streaming down her face. Sometimes love isn't enough, but it should be. It should be enough. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Maya's mother sobbed quietly into her hands. Mrs. Chun and Mrs. Peterson held each other. Even Martinez looked down at her papers, blinking rapidly. Please, Sarah's voice filled the silence. Please don't take him away. He's not just my brother. He's my hero. And heroes. She took a shaky breath. Heroes shouldn't go to jail for trying to save people. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, wiping them slowly. Thank you, Sarah. You may step down. Amy came forward to escort her out, but Sarah turned at the defense table. Before anyone could stop her, she threw her arms around Michael's neck. I love you, she whispered. No matter what happens. Michael hugged her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of drugstore shampoo and laundromat detergent. I love you too, bud. So much. The bailiff let them have their moment before gently separating them. As Sarah walked out with Amy, her back straight and her head high, the afternoon sun caught her blue dress one last time. She looked back at Michael from the doorway, and in that moment, she wasn't just a hungry little girl in a borrowed dress. She was a warrior who had fought for her family with the only weapon she had, truth and love. The door closed behind her. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. We'll recess until tomorrow morning for final arguments and my decision. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. But in the gallery, in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it, Sarah's words continued to echo. Sometimes love isn't enough, but it should be. It should be enough. Morning light filtered through the courthouse windows, painting the judge's bench in shades of gold. The gallery was packed, standing room only. News cameras waited outside, held back by court orders but hungry for the story of the homeless teenager and his little sister who had captured the city's heart. Judge Harrison sat in his chambers, reviewing his notes one final time. Sarah's testimony from yesterday lay on top, her words transcribed in stark black and white. But it was her voice that haunted him, clear, unwavering, full of a love that defied legal precedent. A knock at his door. Your Honor? They're ready. In the holding cell, Michael smoothed his borrowed suit with trembling hands. Stephen sat beside him, reviewing their final statement. Remember, the lawyer said, whatever happens, we can appeal. Michael shook his head. Sarah can't wait that long. The bailiff appeared. Time ago. The courtroom fell silent as Michael entered. He caught glimpses of familiar faces. Mrs. Chun, clutching her purse like a lifeline. Mrs. Peterson, surrounded by Sarah's classmates' letters. Maya and her mother, holding hands tightly. All rise. Judge Harrison took his seat, adjusting his robes. Before we hear final arguments, I have some questions for the prosecution. Martinez stood, her usual confidence slightly dimmed. Yes, Your Honor. In your original filing, you cited the defendant's family history as an aggravating factor. Would you elaborate? Your Honor, the defendant's father is currently serving 10 years for drug distribution. Given this pattern, the judge's voice sharpened. Are you suggesting criminal behavior is hereditary, Ms. Martinez? No, Your Honor, but because what I see in these records is quite different. He lifted a paper. At 14, the defendant dropped out of school, not to sell drugs but to care for his dying mother. At 16, he worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over his sister's head. At 18, he committed his first and only crime, stealing food for a hungry child. Martinez shifted her weight. The law doesn't distinguish. The law must distinguish, counselor. That's why we're here. The judge turned to Stevens. Defense, your final statement? Stevens stood, straightening his tie. Your Honor, we've heard much about what Michael Johnson lacks: money, education, resources. But we've heard even more about what he possesses in abundance: courage, dedication, and a love for his sister that transcends circumstance. He lifted Sarah's letter. This isn't just a criminal case. This is about a family fighting to stay together in a system that too often tears them apart. Yes, Michael Johnson stole food. Yes, he broke the law. But he did so not for profit or greed, but because he couldn't bear to hear his sister's stomach growl for one more night. In the gallery, Mrs. Chin dabbed her eyes. Maya's mother hugged her daughter closer. The prosecution speaks of patterns, Stevens continued. Let's talk about patterns. A pattern of sacrifice. A pattern of putting Sarah's needs before his own. A pattern of love that refuses to break, even under the weight of poverty and loss. He turned to Michael. My client doesn't deny his actions. He doesn't seek to escape responsibility. He seeks only the chance to continue being what he's always been: a brother who would move heaven and earth to protect his sister. The courtroom was silent when Stevens sat. Judge Harrison looked at Martinez. Does the state wish to respond? Martinez stood slowly. She looked at her prepared statement, then at Michael, then at the door where Sarah had stood in her blue dress. Your Honor, the state. She paused, straightening her shoulders. The state wishes to amend its recommendation. A murmur ran through the gallery. While we maintain that Mr. Johnson's actions were criminal, we believe that incarceration would serve neither justice nor the community's interests. We recommend probation, conditional on stable employment and continued custody of his sister. The whispers grew louder. Stevens gripped Michael's shoulder. Furthermore, Martinez continued, her voice stronger, the state withdraws its petition for removal. The bond between these siblings, while unconventional, appears to be the most stable force in both their lives. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. Mr. Johnson, please rise. Michael stood on shaky legs. Young man, I've been on this bench for 23 years. I've seen thousands of cases, heard thousands of stories, but few have moved me like yours. The judge removed his glasses. The law demands justice, but justice without mercy is merely punishment. He lifted Sarah's letter. Your sister called you a hero. Heroes, she said, shouldn't go to jail for trying to save people. While I can't entirely agree, the law must be respected. I find myself unwilling to destroy a family that has already lost so much. Michael's heart pounded so hard he could barely hear. Therefore, I sentence you to 2 years probation, contingent on the following conditions. First, you will maintain steady employment. Mrs. Chen's offer of a position at her market satisfies this requirement. Second, you will complete your GED. The court will provide resources for this. Third, You will check in weekly with a probation officer who will monitor both your progress and Sarah's well-being. The judge paused. Do you understand these conditions? Yes, Your Honor. Michael's voice cracked. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The judge's eyes were kind but firm. Because here's the most important condition. You will never again let pride or shame keep you from asking for help. This community has shown its willingness to support you. Let them. He lifted his gavel. One more thing. The court has received a rather unusual proposal from Mrs. Peterson and your sister's school. They've established a fund, the Johnson Family Support Fund. Local businesses and community members have already pledged significant support. Mrs. Peterson stood, holding a thick envelope. It's not just money, Your Honor. It's supplies, tutoring, medical care, everything they need to stay together. The court approves this arrangement. The judge looked at Michael. Mr. Johnson, do you accept these conditions and this assistance? Michael thought of his mother's letter, of her words about not being alone, of Mrs. Chen's promise to help, of a community that had seen past his crime to his heart. Yes, Your Honor, I accept. The gavel fell. Then this court is adjourned. Bailiff, please bring in Sarah Johnson. The doors opened. Sarah ran in, her blue dress flying, tears streaming down her face. But these were different tears. Tears of joy, of relief, of a future suddenly bright with possibility. She threw herself into Michael's arms. He lifted her, holding her close, breathing in the scent of home and hope and second chances. We did it, Bug, he whispered. We did it. The gallery erupted in applause. Mrs. Chen hugged Mrs. Peterson. Maya jumped up and down, clapping. Even Martinez smiled, closing her case file with a sense of rightness. Outside, the afternoon sun painted Oakland in shades of promise. There would be challenges ahead, probation to complete, a GED to earn, years of poverty's damage to undo. But they would face it together, brother and sister, hero and believer, a family made stronger by the very forces that had tried to break it. And somewhere, in the space between justice and mercy, a new story was beginning. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Martinez Market. Catching dust motes in its golden beams, Michael stood behind the counter, straightening his new navy blue work shirt with assistant manager embroidered above the pocket. 6 months had passed since the trial, each day a step further from desperation and closer to stability. The bell above the door chimed. Mrs. Chen walked in, carrying a box of fresh pastries from the bakery down the street. Early again, she said, nodding approvingly. Just like your father, before. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They both knew the before and after of their lives, the sharp line between what was and what could have been. Registers counted and ready, Michael reported. Did the inventory check last night? We're low on canned vegetables and pasta. Mrs. Chun smiled, watching him move with confidence through the morning routine. You're good at this. Natural talent for business. Michael paused, remembering countless nights counting pennies at the kitchen table, stretching dollars until they screamed. Had to learn young, I guess. The morning passed in a comfortable rhythm. Regular customers came and went, many stopping to chat, to ask about Sarah, to share neighborhood news. Michael knew them all now, not as potential threats or judgmental eyes, but as members of the extended family his trial had somehow created. At precisely 3:15, the bell chimed again. Sarah bounded in, wearing a new backpack and clothes that finally fit properly. Maya followed close behind, both girls chattering about their day. Michael! Sarah ran to hug him. I got an A on my math test. That's my girl. He lifted her up, noticing how much heavier she felt now. Proper meals working their magic. Ice cream to celebrate? Actually, Maya's mother appeared in the doorway. I was hoping both girls could come to our house for dinner. Sarah mentioned you have GED class tonight. Michael hesitated, old protective instincts flaring. But Sarah's hopeful face and Mrs. Chen's gentle nod reminded him of the judge's words. Let people help. That would be great, thanks. As Sarah and Maya left with promises to finish homework before playing, Michael caught a glimpse of his reflection in the store window. The haunted look was fading from his eyes. The borrowed suit was gone, replaced by clothes that marked honest work and steady paychecks. The afternoon shift passed quickly. At 6, Michael locked up, following his new routine. Bus to the community college. 2 hours of GED prep. Then home to their apartment. The same one, but different now. The walls had fresh paint, courtesy of the Johnson Family Support Fund. Real furniture filled the rooms, donated by community members who'd followed their story. A proper stove had replaced the hot plate. The cabinets held more than hope and empty promises. Michael unlocked the door, hearing voices inside. Maya's mother had brought Sarah home, and the apartment smelled like home-cooked food. "We brought leftovers," Sarah called out. "Real spaghetti and meatballs." Michael's throat tightened. Their mother's recipe. Maya's mom had asked for it specially. "How was class?" Sarah asked, setting the table with their new plates. A housewarming gift from Mrs. Peterson. "Good. Taking practice tests next week." Michael hung up his work shirt. "Think I might be ready for the real thing soon." Sarah beamed. "You'll pass. You're the smartest person I know." After dinner, they settled into their new routine. Homework at the actual kitchen table. A load of laundry in the building's now working machines. A call to their probation officer. More a friendly check-in these days than a supervision. "Oh." Sarah jumped up. "I almost forgot. Mrs. Peterson gave me something for you." She pulled an envelope from her backpack. Inside was a brochure for the local community college. "Business Administration Program, read the cover." She said, "With your GED almost done, you should think about it." Sarah bounced on her toes. "You're already so good at running the market." Michael stared at the brochure. College had been an impossible dream for so long. But now, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Chun stood there with a familiar blue cookie jar. "Found this in storage," she said. "Thought you might want it back." Michael took the jar, feeling its weight. Inside, where his mother's savings had once hidden, was a new note. "For your college fund. A community investment in our future manager. Chun Family Market, Mrs. Chun. I can't dash, you can." She patted his cheek. "Your mother would be proud. Both of you." After she left, Michael and Sarah sat on their small balcony. A luxury they'd never used before, too afraid of being seen, being judged. The city lights sparkled below, each one representing a home, a family, a story. "Michael." Sarah leaned against his shoulder. "Are we okay now?" He pulled her close, thinking of everything that had changed. The market job with its steady paycheck and health insurance. The support fund that helped with utilities and school supplies. The neighbors who'd become family. The community that had seen their worth beyond their poverty. "Yeah, Bug, we're okay. Because of you," she said firmly. "Because you never left. Because we never left each other," he corrected. "And because we finally learned to let others in." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the moon rise over Oakland. Tomorrow would bring more work, more studies, more small steps toward a future that looked nothing like their past. But tonight, in an apartment that finally felt like home, with full bellies and hearts, they were more than survivors. They were proof that sometimes love was enough. Not alone, but when combined with the community's compassion and a justice system's mercy. Michael thought of their mother's letter, now framed on his bedroom wall. Of their father, who might one day want to know how his children had broken his pattern of destruction. Of Judge Harrison, who'd seen beyond the law to the human hearts beneath. Sarah had fallen asleep against his shoulder, peaceful in a way she hadn't been in years. Carefully, he carried her to her bed, a real bed now, with proper sheets and a handmade quilt from Mrs. Peterson. "Good night, Bug," he whispered, tucking her in. "Night, Michael." She stirred slightly. "Love you." "Love you too." In his own room, Michael changed into sleep clothes that weren't worn thin with worry. The business college brochure lay on his nightstand beside his GED study guides. On the wall, his mother's letter hung next to his work schedule and Sarah's perfect math test. Outside, the city hummed with life. Inside, their apartment held the quiet peace of a family healing. Not perfect, not wealthy, but whole. Together. Michael thought of Sarah's words in court, echoing across months of change. Heroes shouldn't go to jail for trying to save people. Maybe she'd been right about him being a hero. Not the kind in a cape or a borrowed suit, but the kind who stayed. The kind who learned that asking for help wasn't weakness but wisdom. The kind who showed a little girl that love, while not always enough on its own, could build bridges to everything else they needed. As sleep came, Michael smiled. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, bills to pay, tests to study for, a future to build. But they would face it together, supported by a community that had become family, guided by lessons learned in their darkest hours. They were more than their poverty now, more than their past, more than their pain. They were home. They were whole. They were, finally and forever, free to simply be brother and sister, walking toward a future bright with promise and possibility. And that was everything.